Simone de Beauvoir's 1949 book, The Second Sex, tell us about dating today? I'm Dr. Ellie Anderson, philosophy professor and co-host of Overthink podcast, and I want to talk about why I think that Simone de Beauvoir's work, especially the chapter The Woman in Love from The Second Sex, is far from dated, even though it might seem to be very dated at first. I'm developing this analysis based on a 2017 conference paper that I gave at the Simone de Beauvoir Society, which is an international society of scholars that meets yearly to talk about Beauvoir. Great society. I presented there a number of times, but this paper sort of went into hibernation as I began to work on other things. And I thought it would be high time to talk about some of the findings of it, even though it's not published in the form that it took then. So, at first glance, one of the most dated aspects of The Second Sex, I think, might seem to be its portrayal of the dynamics of romantic love between women and men. Beauvoir has chapters such as The Married Woman, The Mother, and The Woman in Love, where she describes women who seek to channel their frustrated freedoms through attachments to male lovers and husbands. These women under patriarchy stake their identities and futures on finding Mr. Right. Now, the situation that Beauvoir describes can be seen as dated for a number of reasons now, 70 years after its publication. For one, it's largely heteronormative, in spite of the fact that Beauvoir includes a chapter on the lesbian. In addition, it would seem that the influx of women into the workplace since its publication would have resolved the problem of women's inability to seek transcendence through work. At the same time, there's a marked lack of intersectionality in Beauvoir's account, such that she's not recognizing that many women of lower classes and lower income brackets are actually already working. So Beauvoir posits women's access to work as the solution to romantic inequality throughout The Second Sex, which I think now just seems like a dated and very non-intersectional approach. In addition to that, the moves toward greater sexual liberation in the wake of the time that Beauvoir was writing would seem to have fundamentally transformed the way that romantic couples interact, especially in sexual settings, which you might think would render Beauvoir's account, again, quite dated. Nowadays, there's been the rise of the casual hookup scene, where we could define hookups as sexual encounters between acquaintances, friends, or strangers who share no expectation of commitment. If you want to hear more about hookup culture specifically and my thoughts on it as a feminist philosopher, we have a podcast episode of Overthink called Hooking Up. Nowadays, people can meet on Hinge, Tinder, Bumble, Grindr, Field, often seeking no strings attached arrangements that imply an equal range of choice and agency among genders. However, in spite of this seemingly utopian situation, which if you're watching this video, you probably already recognize is not so utopian, research from the social sciences suggests that recent decades have seen a retrenchment of patriarchal power in the domain of heterosexual romantic love and sex. Take, for instance, one study showing that women experience a much greater discrepancy than men in describing their actual hookups versus their ideal hookups. So men's actual versus ideal hookups were a lot closer than women's. There was a huge gap for women. There's also a really strong inequality in sex practices between men and women. The majority of women do not experience orgasm during hookups, whereas the majority of men do. And women frequently give oral sex to men without reciprocity. Peggy Orenstein's book, Girls and Sex, has a lot on this, and there's also some other great research. There's also research suggesting that women experience more guilt, regret, and shame about hookups, and are less likely than men to recount a hookup experience as positive after the fact. So there was one very different study in particular that treats the risks that men and women perceive in hooking up. Women perceive the fear of getting emotionally attached to a partner as a major risk. And men perceived the fear of their partners getting emotionally attached to them as a major risk. That is to say, both men and women take it for granted that hooking up may be unworkable because women's, not men's, feelings get in the way. Because feelings are discouraged in hookup culture, this suggests that men more smoothly and successfully function within the rules of its game, while women find it challenging and often impossible to do so. I think this trend plays out in many a college dorm, as well as maybe a living room or a brunch spot, a brunch between women, where two or more women gather together to talk about, quote, boy problems. And these discussions are really attempts to understand and conform to expected practices within a culture that leaves heterosexual women unsatisfied, a culture that casts them as stage 5 clingers, as crazy, or as desperate. If you want to hear more on my thoughts on this kind of labor of interpretation, I have a paper called Hermeneutic Labor where I discuss this in greater detail. Even as hookup culture is a relatively new social configuration, its emotional structure finds its forerunner in Beauvoir's analysis of the woman in love. Here is where I think Beauvoir is interesting and relevant in spite of the limitations that I mentioned at the beginning. Beauvoir writes, quote, "Male desire is as fleeting as it is imperious. Once satisfied, it dies rather quickly, while it is most often after love that the woman becomes his prisoner," end quote. Seems potentially dated out of context, but when you take into account all of the contemporary studies about hookup culture that I have just mentioned, it seems like a lot has persisted. And the inequities in romance today don't only go for the hookup scene. They also extend to more traditional dating practices. There was a survey of dating research over the past 35 years that was published, I think by now 10-ish years ago, where psychologists Asia Anna Eaton and Susanna Rose report that gender differences and inequalities in dating scripts have hardly changed at all in the past 35 years. Men remain active agents, by and large asking women out, choosing the time and location of the date, and often paying for the activity, while women are expected to subject their bodies to grueling rounds of waxing, shaving, blow-drying, and making themselves up, being expected to be pleasant, feminine, sexualized objects. I think this has shifted a little bit in the 5 years since I first presented this work, although I think a lot of these inequities would still remain. This structure leads psychologists Carolyn Bradshaw, Arnold S. Kahn, and Brian K. Saville to state, this is a quote from them, "Although gender roles may be changing, research suggests the changes have had little effect on traditional dating." So gender roles have changed in a lot of ways, but they've had very little effect on traditional dating. And the entrenched patriarchy in dating scripts, I think, is particularly nefarious when we consider how it intersects with domestic violence and rape. Research has shown that the acceptance of traditional romantic beliefs is associated with romanticizing the patterns of control and jealousy that indicate intimate partner violence. So literally accepting traditional romantic beliefs is associated with romanticizing patterns of control and jealousy that can indicate intimate partner violence. Just wanted to say that one more time. So this research that I'm talking about shows that women in the domain of heterosexual dating are still perceived to be imminent and passive objects of male desire in many contexts. And this echoes Beauvoir's account of romantic love quite a bit. It also suggests that there has been what's called a gamification of dating, where men both set and reinforce the rules. Under these circumstances, Beauvoir's account of the sovereignty of male values and behaviors, I think, rings as true today as it did in 1949. Also relevant is her claim that women are part of the goods that men possess and a means of exchange among themselves. So in contemporary dating and hookup cultures, women are treated as replaceable commodities who serve as a means to sexual gratification and elevated social status. Even as women have increasingly gained access across class spectrum to education and work, the asymmetry in heterosexual dating has widened even further. Research has shown that men are equally, if not more likely, to accept a romantic partner who is younger and or less educated than themselves, while women seek and are sought by men who are older and equally or better educated than themselves. And I should just briefly note that I have a version of this paper on my academia.edu page, so you can read along and check out all the footnotes, all the citations that I'm using. I'll link that below. This means that men are left with a much wider pool of women to choose from than women are. And this wide pool, combined with the seemingly infinite availability of potential partners that dating apps and websites offer, leads to what consumer studies scholars call the variety drive. While access to a wider potential range of sexual and romantic partners is an exciting feature of contemporary dating, right? Like, it's cool to have so many options. It can raise your standards. It can also lead to a kind of flooding the market in which each potential partner diminishes in value by virtue of the sheer number of options that the people they're dating are faced with. And it's clear that Beauvoir would agree that the gender who's controlling the flooded dating market is the same one that's been setting the rules since the invention of history. I want to bring into the discussion here the 2012 book by sociologist Eva Illouz, Why Love Hurts, because Illouz offers a very compelling account of the structures that underlie the inequality of contemporary romantic love. She argues that patriarchal society has responded to the gains of the women's movement by exerting masculine power over the domain that was traditionally considered the most important for women, that of romantic love. Illouz specifically claims that there is what she calls an emotional inequality in heterosexual love, in which men exert power over women through commitment phobia. Where contemporary dating scripts urge women to seek fulfillment through supportive, reciprocal romantic partnerships that involve feelings of love, men have been taught to exhibit an absence of feeling and an unwavering commitment to autonomy and indifference. This has allowed men to exert power over them by choosing to grant or reject this desire. Men's expression of strong feelings of love and commitment is perceived as a rare and hard-won reward for women's correctly playing the game. And I think in the past couple of years since I wrote the first version of this, there have been some changes with the rise of like the soft boy or the quote woke feminist boy who nonetheless often ends up reproducing the structures of misogyny. So I would maybe just want to kind of add that into the mix, even though I think the broad structures of Illouz's view as articulated in 2012, do tend to play out. Playing the game is correctly, Illouz points out, is more difficult for women than men, not because women are more naturally emotional or prone to desire relationships, as evolutionary psychologists operating with a very wrong-headed view of gender norms would suggest, but it's actually more difficult for women because the patriarchal structures that tend to associate women with emotion and men with rational detachment ensure that men's affections are scarce, even as women are brought up to value romantic love and the strong feelings that it's taken to involve. So Illouz puts it this way. She says, clearly, men dominate the rules of recognition and commitment, end quote. And I think this domination seems very, it's invisible in a lot of ways. And it seems kind of like weird conspiracy theory-ish at first, because we're not saying here that it actually needs to be the conscious intention of any individual agent, right? We're talking on a structural, sociological level. Illouz is a sociologist. From childhood, for instance, women received mixed messages about romantic love. They're taught that it should be the fulfillment of their wildest dreams, the chance to give themselves completely to a loved one, and yet in order to achieve it, they're also encouraged to play it cool and not scare the man away. These conflicting expectations put women in a double bind. Take, for instance, a woman named Irene, whom Illouz interviewed. Irene is in a committed relationship and desires to get engaged with her partner. She's been raised to think that marriage is a value, and yet she is terrified to put pressure on her partner to get engaged. She expresses a fear of putting pressure on her partner, stating, if you put pressure, you come across as needy. The guy's going to run away. I would love to say freely, I love you, but if I did it, I would feel like the inferior party. You want to remain cool. End quote. On Illouz's view, patriarchal inequality has shored up the losses that it's faced in the past 50 years of the women's movement, say, by unleashing its power over contemporary dating culture. While dating and sex practices have always conformed to patriarchal modes of exchanging and possessing women, Illouz shows that these practices take on a new valence in the 20th and 21st centuries, because masculine emotional withdrawal and commitment phobia become the norm. And she draws on extensive research to show that as recently as the Victorian period, passionate expressions of devotional love were coded as positive signs of masculinity. And it's only in recent decades that distance and detachment have come to be key features of men's emotional styles when relating to women. Illouz traces this development alongside the diminishing of three domains in which masculinity was historically expressed, namely home, work, and all-male associations. Whereas social scripts used to posit men as the authoritative head of the household, feminist movements in the 50s and 60s destabilized their authority and led to more diverse and egalitarian approaches to home life. But in the realm of work, the second domain that Illouz mentions, The increasing bureaucratization of corporate capitalism diminishes the sense of independence and agency in the workplace for both men and women. Finally, in this third domain that Illouz identifies, the venues for all-male leisure, which used to take place in spots such as clubs and pubs, have largely been replaced by all-gender modes of socialization in bars, amateur hobby leagues, and gyms. As a result, Illouz writes that men transferred to sexuality the control they formerly had in the household, such that detachment in sexuality came to signal and organize the broader trope of autonomy and control, and thus of masculinity. She says emotional detachment could be viewed as a metaphor for masculine autonomy. As men and women grow closer to equality in other domains of human society, albeit still far from achieving it, emotional inequality in romantic love becomes more and more salient. Sexuality has become a field of struggle, Illouz suggests, because it enables the acquisition and maintenance of male social status. Thus, dating becomes a playing field in which men have, as Illouz says, quote, a greater capacity to control the emotional interaction through greater detachment, end quote. And the unevenness of this playing field is obscured by the increasing democratization of dating, right? So we can think that dating is really democratic when in fact the sort of rules of this field are not so, as Illouz points out. Because more than ever, individuals can meet a vast range of people from different socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, career, and educational backgrounds through easy access via free apps and popular pickup spots such as bars and clubs. And of course, it's undoubtedly true that there are benefits to the cultural acceptance of casual sexual encounters for both men and women. But it's also clear that the power between the genders is unevenly distributed in practice. What's more, because of the aforementioned reasons that offer heterosexual men a wider dating pool than hetero women, there's a sense of overabundance for men that makes women stand apart as desirable only if they're able to stay cool and emotionally detached. When I was first writing this paper in 2017, I came across an article from New York Magazine's advice column, Ask Polly. And it described a woman who kept getting dropped by men, even as they told her that she was great and deserved a great guy. This woman wrote that she worries that, quote, her friendly and kind disposition, punctuated with a readiness to text back without waiting a few hours, doesn't provide the scarcity that people need to induce desire, end quote. This claim illustrates Illouz's notion that men are more likely to overcome emotional withdrawal toward a particular woman when they feel she is a scarce resource because of her exceptional array of qualities. There's a whole industry of self-help literature that teaches women that they merely need to overcome their neediness and desperation, rather than encouraging them to question the very culture that treats them as economic resources, subject to the fluctuations of market value. What was the columnist Polly's advice to Irene? She told her to chill out. She said, I'm sure you're too eager in the totally mundane ways that many of us are too eager, and that you're doing your best to squelch it, yet you'll never really succeed at coming across as chill. What Irene needed to do to keep men's interest, according to this professional dispenser of advice, was to stop being so eager. A major trend that points to the emotional inequality of modern dating as well is the popular expression of ghosting. We also have a podcast episode on ghosting, if you want to check it out. It's a very early one. Ghosting is the practice of cutting off all communication from a person with whom one is sexually or romantically involved and giving no explanation. And I love this example from Vice magazine, which a columnist described. It happened again. I hooked up with someone. This time it was an adult skateboarder who repeatedly told me that he wanted to see me again. This foolishly made me believe he might want to see me again. Rather than respond to my text 2 days later, he chose to pull the digital version of that scene in every teen movie where one pretends to be a lifeless mannequin while on the run from mall cops. Weird, he was just here a minute ago. As I was reading that, I remembered that I think we actually talked about that on the podcast episode 2, so I'm sorry for repeating myself. I love that story about the adult skateboarder. But the practice of ghosting can really lead to confusion and frustration on the part of the person who's ghosted because they're ignorant of the reasons for that ghosting, right? And even though ghosting is definitely not gender specific, a quick search for threads on Reddit or hashtags on Twitter and Instagram reveals that the ones trying to cope with being ghosted are overwhelmingly women. Beauvoir might as well be describing one of them when she states, quote, I knew a woman who greeted her lover with surprise each time they met. "I thought you would never return," she would say. And if he asked her why, "Because you could never return. When I wait, I always have the impression that I will never see you again." End quote. Individuals in contemporary hookup and dating cultures have the capacity to withdraw not only emotion, but also communication at any time. It's the individual left behind who must pay the emotional price for this withdrawal. Yet, because the rules of hookup culture take emotional investment to be off the table from the beginning, the one who suffers from being ghosted can very easily be blamed for not abiding to the agreed upon rules of the game. Your fault, you caught feelings. One final example I want to draw on in terms of the inequality of this emotional configuration is that of the fuckboy. I think the rise of the fuckboy was really in the 2010s, where, for instance, a Vanity Fair article from 2015 defines a fuckboy as a young man who sleeps with women without any intention of having a relationship with them, and perhaps even walking them to the door post-sex. The implication of the negative connotation of the term fuckboy is that most millennial women are not looking for a casual hookup. And this hypothesis is also borne out in research from the social sciences. Thus, heterosexual women are often on the lookout to avoid fuckboys, frequently warning each other about them. There was this viral, although short-lived, app called Lulu, also in the 2010s, which offered a forum for women to rate men they knew and to warn women who were meeting these men on dating websites and apps that if they were known to take advantage of women and misrepresent their intentions. Obviously a very gendered term, right? Fuckboy. There's not a female equivalent for that. So if the emotional landscape of the contemporary dating scene is hazardous for women in some of the same ways that Beauvoir identified in 1949, then why do women partake in it? Studies show that both male and female college students endorse hookup culture. Beauvoir would respond that women remain duped into enjoying the small advantages that they gain from it, fail to see just how stacked the deck is against them, and are tempted to bask in their condition of dependence through bad faith. Bad faith, an existential concept that I have some other material on elsewhere. But Illouz has an additional answer that I find to be very Beauvoirian in spirit. She states that both men and women seek recognition of their very being through romantic love. For both Beauvoir and Illouz, genuine love offers an affirmation of the subject through the free exchange of recognition. Both thinkers suggest that recognition is foreclosed in situations of gender inequality. And Illouz states that this desire for recognition is essentially in conflict with the emotional inequality and masculine commitment phobia that characterize contemporary dating. She also adds a historical dimension to this. According to Illouz, the idea that one must gain ontological security or security in one's very being from romantic love is relatively new. In the past, such security was offered by a hierarchical class structure where each individual had a specific role to play. A very strange consequence of the strides that social democratization has achieved in recent centuries and definitely in decades is that romantic love comes to be the new arbiter of self-worth, Illouz suggests. In Beauvoir's account, lovers desire to be recognized for their inherent value as embodied free subjects. But the joys of recognition are ensured not only by the erotic encounter between self and other, but also by the promise of commitment. One feels recognized as freedom in romantic love if one's lover freely commits to continuing this love and to engaging his freedom with one's own. And super quick caveat here is that I think we need to conceive of commitment pretty broadly. If you know any of my other work, you will know that I am not committed, let's say, to a norm of monogamous heterosexual marriage by any means. Beauvoir was not either. So I think thinking about commitment more broadly is going to be a lot more beneficial than trying to fit it into this old conservative package. But nonetheless, like some form of commitment as a desire to continue the relationship, Beauvoir thinks is important. And this promise of commitment is precisely what the rules of contemporary dating tend to foreclose. As Illouz writes, quote, both men and women act as if commitment were not a priori embedded in the relationship, at the very same time that these relationships are required to provide an ongoing work of recognition, end quote. This denial of the desire for recognition through commitment is a way of valorizing autonomy that Beauvoir would describe as a classic case of bad faith, of misunderstanding the nature of your own freedom. Individuals are denying their situatedness and their boundedness to others by believing they are pure freedoms. In The Second Sex, Beauvoir writes that woman dreams of reconciling independence and love. Unfortunately, that dream appears as far from reality for contemporary women as it did for those Beauvoir was writing about in 1949.